We'll wait just a second for everyone to join us, but we'll get started pretty soon. All right, so welcome and thank you for joining us for tonight's live event, Polychromy and You. I'm Lisa Anderson-Zhu, Associate Curator of Ancient Mediterranean Art at the Walters Art Museum. First, we must express our gratitude to the Boshell Foundation for funding an endowment to support tonight's event. The Walters hosts Boshell Lectures twice per year with topics focusing on archaeology and history in relation to the museum's collections. And I really want to thank the members of the Boshell family for their generosity, which makes this program possible. So now for a brief introduction to polychromy and what it means to you and me. Polychromy refers to the practice of painting sculpture in multiple colors. Ancient sculptures in all materials would often be quite colorful, although the colors usually survive only in traces. The polychromy on this Etruscan head is excellently preserved, likely due in part to the porous surface of the ceramic head. Polychromy on marble is often far less well preserved, with the traces sometimes invisible to the naked eye, giving the impression that most of the surface was unpainted and generally monochrome white. The idea of painted marble statues might be surprising and new to you. Yet Greek and Roman authors wrote about painted sculpture, and the preserved traces of color on statues like this one verify that fact. The blue arrow here points to traces of the red paint that would have originally covered Aphrodite's drapery. In her late 19th century work, Polychromy in Greek Statues, Maxime Clignon stated that there was no longer a question of whether or not ancient sculpture was painted, and that ancient polychromy was considered a matter of fact, and arguments against it, drawn merely from aesthetics or from sentiment, could not prevail against abundant testimony. She was firm that the principle of polychromy itself is no longer contested. Our speakers tonight will talk more about specific aspects of ancient polychromy in the present, including how to detect and interpret microscopic pigments, and also the ways in which ancient marble sculptures have been politicized. I want to spend a minute reflecting on aesthetics or sentiment as a reason for the rejection of painted classical sculpture, even by scholars. More or less since the Renaissance, marble sculptures haven't usually been painted. Michelangelo didn't paint his David. Bernini didn't paint his Daphne and Apollo. We've gotten so used to seeing marble sculpture in one white way that for some modern people, colorful classical sculptures feel wrong. Yet an ancient Roman would look at an unpainted marble sculpture and say, well, that looks nice enough, but it's not finished yet. There are many other ancient stone and marble works at the Walters Art Museum that still bear traces of color. It's hard to reconstruct the full original ancient appearance, but better preserved painted surfaces, like what we see here on this wooden portrait and this terracotta figurine, give a sense of how skillfully and how fully painted the stone surfaces might have been. It can be natural to prefer things that you're used to or are familiar with. So all things being equal, if the existence of ancient polychromy is new to you and you find you're not initially enamored with the look of painted classical statues, it could be that you are not yet used to seeing the bold, lively, and colorful, fully painted version of sculpture that ancient people lived with. And so we need to show you more of it through events like this to expand your paint palette, as it were. Now let me say a little bit about logistics for this event. Please type your questions into chat or comments as you think of them, whether you're streaming on Facebook or YouTube. We're not going to break between the panelists' presentations, but we will have time to take questions during a moderated discussion at the end. Our first panelist is the person you call when you find an elaborately painted ancient marble in museum storage and you wonder, is this paint as old as I think it is? Professor Mark Abbe is a specialist in the study of color in ancient Mediterranean art, particularly related to Greek and Roman marble sculptures and their original coloration and polychromy. Trained at New York University Institute of Fine Arts, he received his PhD in Greek and Roman art and archaeology, and he also received an advanced certificate in conservation. He is associate professor of ancient art at the University of Georgia in Athens, where he founded the multidisciplinary Ancient Polychromy Network, and he is also associated faculty in the Department of Classics. If you've read anything about the ancient world in popular news recently, there's a high chance that our second panelist was involved, for she's a public historian and regular contributor to hyperallergic.com. Sarah E. Bond is an associate professor of history at the University of Iowa. She's interested in late Roman history, epigraphy, late antique law, digital humanities, polychromy, and the socio-legal experience of ancient marginal peoples. She received her PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and got her BA in classics from the University of Virginia. Her book, Trade and Taboo, Disreputable Professionals in the Roman Mediterranean, was published in 2016. You can follow her at Sarah E. Bond on Twitter. Thank you both so much for joining us. Now let's get started with Mark.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Lisa. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. Before I speak about examples of color on marble sculpture and aspects of ancient identity and ethnicity, I'd like to encourage you to view this discussion really as an invitation to revisit what are perhaps the most assumed works of art in the Walters and other museums, namely ancient marble sculpture, and to do so with new eyes and fresh, intimate, inquisitive scrutiny. As Lisa mentioned, since the 16th century, we have largely looked at marble sculpture as self-evidently monochrome and concerned primarily with aesthetic ideals that are most often utterly decontextualized from their ancient environments and cultures, such as simplicity, proportion, purity of form, if not as symbols of immaculate whiteness. That is, the absence or negation of color, which has been considered the proper domain of sculpture, with color being the domain of painting in the Renaissance, in Western art since the Renaissance Paragone. Very little of this has to do with antiquity and what we commonly identify as the naturalism of ancient marble sculpture, which was, of course, originally polychrome, to aid legibility, enhance differentiation, and in context, in their ancient display contexts, serve to both align and distinguish them from other nearby images. Burial, early discovery, historic restoration, and traditional cleaning techniques, and I would add the widespread tacit assumption that no color remains on the surfaces of marble sculptures, have all reduced what survived from antiquity. At present, we are in the midst of a deep and creative rethinking about color and materiality in Greek and Roman art, and these cultures' places within a wider Mediterranean horizon. Our research is aided, as Lisa mentioned, by new multidisciplinary ways of examination, scientific analysis, and archival research that are all based on and build upon a foundation of more extensive research in the 19th and 20th centuries. Even the most iconic masterpieces of classical sculpture, such as the Parthenon pediments, have begun to reveal important vestiges of color and patterning. And in thinking about coloration on these monuments, we would do well to remember, for example, that Phidias's brother or nephew, Paeonius, was a distinguished painter, and that the composition, style, and narrative of the pedimental sculpture were no doubt influenced by contemporary painting. Investigations into the polychromy of Greek and Roman sculpture constitute a new microsurface archaeology of these artworks. The evidence is inevitably fragmentary and often deteriorated, but provide new insights, such as the flesh pigmentation on this statuette in Providence. Even works seemingly devoid of color, such as these exquisitely well-preserved portrait busts of the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus and his wife Julia Domina, reveal complex surfaces in ultraviolet and infrared light, as well as vestiges of color. Here are some microscopic views of a complex series of paint layers on the emperor's fringed originally light purple cloak, and more extensive washes of color over the outer garments of both, something of which you can compare to contemporary Fayum portraits. While some icons of well-preserved painting have long been recognized, such as the so-called Alexander sarcophagus from the royal necropolis at Sidon, discovered in 1887, others are new and originate from current archaeological excavations, such as these remarkable state relief monuments currently being studied and excavated at Nicomedia, directed by the Turkish archaeologist Tunasara Agturk. They depict an imperial arrival or adventus ceremony of the emperors Diocletian and Maximian, and different ethnic burials captured, different ethnic barbarians captured in battle at Bottom. Interestingly, the authenticity of many of the most important examples of ancient polychromy have been long off public view, as their authenticity has been doubted. This is the case with this remarkable head, an Aphrodite of Cnidos type, here at the Walters, first documented with Maurice Naumann, based in Cairo, and acquired by Henry Walters in New York in 1927. This head is currently the subject of a detailed, comprehensive, multidisciplinary study by a number of people here at the Walters, including Lisa, conservators Angela Elliott, and graduate fellow Hayden Dine, now on fellowship at the Harvard Art Museums, and essential conservation scientist Glenn Gates. This combination of ancient specialists, conservators, and conservation science, and a conservation scientist is exactly the kind of multidisciplinary, object-oriented research that polychrome research requires. Yeah, and it's exactly the kind of thing that the Walters excels at. Masterfully and subtly carved and polished in the 2nd century AD, probably carved in Parian marble. Despite its awkward, almost painfully awkward modern mount, this is a remarkable piece of polychrome sculpture, one of our best survivals from the Roman period. It was freed from much of its barrel accretion in the 1990s, and the ancient polychromy is well intact. It includes subtle multiple layers of painting on the hair, as you see here behind the right ear. The hair includes localized gilded highlights over a broad swath of the hair, the kind of material that we have very fragmentary evidence of elsewhere. Here we can make out the whole patterning of it, and the pink organic dyed diadem with a pattern of gilded ornamentation. We even have on the flesh surfaces of the face traces of what appear to be an ancient wax layer akin to ancient gnosis. Now let me turn to the U of this program's title, namely the often fluid issues of identity and ethnicity in antiquity. These sculptures, previously illustrated, were the product of the Roman Empire, the diverse, multicultural, and multi-ethnic, globalized world of the ancient Mediterranean and beyond, that it incorporated and at times was ruled by peoples from across a vast, broad, ethnic and cultural range. Yeah, the empire stretched from Morocco to Scotland, from the Ukraine to Arabia and southern Egypt, and almost everything in between. Yeah. The biographies of Septimius, Severus, and Julia Domina are illustrative. Septimius was from Africa Proconsularis in modern-day Libya and was a native Punic speaker who allegedly never spoke Latin without a Berber accent. His wife, here at left, was from Homs in modern Syria, and her family was associated with a celebrated cult of the Semitic god Baal. This remarkable painted depiction of the Roman emperor and his family, our only surviving example from antiquity, gives you at the very least something of how contemporaries thought of their appearance, while no doubt reflecting conventional gendered skin color. A darker male skinned color for Septimius, and a more translucent, paler, whiter female complexion for Julia. Ancient portraits, despite their lifelike realism and nuanced differentiation, were of course highly constructed images, not literal photographs. Color was not simply about skin tone, I want to emphasize, but about age, gender, character, and much else. Ethnicity, and particularly skin pigmentation in the ancient Mediterranean world, is a notoriously complex subject. Speaking in the most general terms, painting with the broadest brush, if you will, in the main, a wide range of light to medium brown skin pigmentation appears to have been considered ethically normative in the Roman period, in this cosmopolitan age. Perhaps something of this may be glimpsed in the core range of such color in the corpus of so-called Fayum portraits. But the evidence here, and I would emphasize this, requires careful local contextualization. Here, I juxtapose a contemporaneous marble bust at right from Egypt with a similar Fayum portrait to give you a sense of the possible original coloration and immediate effect of how a marble portrait would have appeared when polychrome. Conspicuously other, from the cosmopolitan mindset of the Roman world, were the pale and red-haired people from the northern Hyperborean realms, and the much darker skin tones of people in the distant southern regions, often identified as Libyans, Arabians, or most commonly Ethiopians. Such distinctions, such ethnic distinctions, were of course highly fluid and intimately related to culture in ways not entirely alien to our own polyethnic world. At present, the evidence for painted eye color, hair color, and skin color, and even of the colorful ethnic costumes that we read about on marble sculpture, is frustratingly limited. There's simply much to do. We can, however, gain glimpse something of the ethnic and cultural diversity on Roman portraits straight away once you recognize it. The thick, spiky, clumped locks of hair on a number of portraits from ancient Gaul or France have been identified as a red hairstyle, so-called rotuli comi in Latin. In contrast, Roman norms are often not adopted in mainland Greece, which in the Roman period had an acute historical self-consciousness of their past. Here you have from Athens a remarkably heroic, if not royal, leonine mane of hair of some high-ranked unknown individual that is probably modeled off of earlier notions of the Greek heroic past. That is the case too with a remarkable portrait bust that you see at left here. In contrast, I show you the deliberately retro-styled, austere mode of both costume and of self-representation of the celebrated political and cultural leader of Athens in the 2nd century, Herodes Atticus. In the context of local Athenian politics, his image is one of modest reserve and with the demeanor and style of a leader of the classical Athenian polis from the 5th century BC. More on Herodes Atticus in a minute. A group of black stone statues used a luxurious material to demarcate exotic, dark skin color and ethnicity, namely as Ethiopians, such as this exquisite head of a youth, said to be from Asia Minor and often dated from the Hellenistic period. This is more probably, in my view, a product of the Roman imperial period, probably the 2nd century AD, and the remarkable workmanship and frontality of the head suggest it was a top quality herm as found elsewhere in the empire, such as a more modest example at right. These are, however, examples of an ethnic type, or ethne, not portraits of distinct individuals. Scholars have identified a relatively small number of marble portraits as Ethiopians by their physiognomy, including these portrait heads from the Agora in Athens. Interestingly, the finely carved head at the right has an unusual rasp finish over the flesh areas that may be linked with a distinctive, unique kind of surface treatment and painting. These portraits were proud civic honors for things achieved and pious votive dedications to the gods. They were declarations of cultural and ethnic hybridity, one could argue. They display Greek hairstyles and self-fashioning while retaining a distinct ethnic identity. That is, that they were assertions of both ethnic difference and collective Greek and Athenian group membership. In the hybrid language of identity in present-day America, we might consider them African Athenians, or more correctly, Ethiopian Athenians. More concrete statements can be made of this superbly nuanced and extremely sophisticated in its characterization head from Greece. It represents a favored Ethiopian pupil and adopted son of Herodes Atticus, called Memnon. He was one of three youths or pupils, all of whom appeared to have died in the mid-160s AD during the first large-scale empire-wide pandemic known as the Antonine Plague that is thought to have killed upwards of 5 million people within the empire. The head and other now headless herms commemorated Memnon as Herodes' hunting partner and celebrated his honor, noble mind, and religious and rigorous education and cultural study in Greece. The name Memnon likens him to Menon, the great Ethiopian semi-divine king active in the Trojan War, who was celebrated by Homer as a near equal to Achilles. The unprecedented nickname, Topodion, is especially interesting. Although perhaps deriving from the similar verb meaning to seek, as it would be appropriate for the hunt, Memnon was commemorated probably in the term here may evokes Topazaios, which was a near legendary island deep in the distant in the Red Sea. Scholars have generally identified Topodion as a kind of a nickname, that was one of a larger group of intimate nicknames derived from precious gemstones. The name need not refer specifically to the brown and green gems that were mined at Topazaios, but rather the larger circulation of such luxury gems from the trans-Indian and sub-Saharan trade. And while simultaneously evoking this rich, distant, near legendary island. The learned wordplay by Herodes Atticus, identifying Memnon as little Topazaios rather than as literally little topaz, as has been proposed, was no doubt an allusion to Memnon's notably an ethnically different dark skin color and his non-Greek origin of distinguished mytho-historical precedents. Here, the Ethiopians' qualities were forwarded and on the surface in the celebrated Homeric name, the unusual nickname, Topazaios, the physiognomy, and no doubt the sculpture's seemingly lost but unexamined color. So what are we doing when we study the color of ancient marble sculpture, and to what end? Many things, but our view of Greek and Roman sculpture can all too easily become encrusted in and by common post-antique assumptions. Recovering the true colors of ancient sculpture not only gives these works a fresh vitality and immediacy, it also allows us to recover important insights into their original true diversity and complex identities. We would be deeply mistaken to see, recognize, or identify ourselves too literally in such works. But when we learn about color in one culture and one historical period, especially those far removed from our own, that encourages us to reframe the familiar and the assumed, and it sharpens our minds to critically reflect both on ourselves and on our present world. Thank you.
So much for that, Mark. I just want to remind everyone to feel free to type up and submit your questions or comments on Facebook and YouTube as you think of them. We're seeing them already. And we'll take questions for both panelists at the end. So now let's hear from Sarah.
Okay, we should be able to see the first slide now. But I wanted to say good evening and thank you to the Walters Art Museum and the Boshell Foundation for bringing Professor Abbe and I together tonight. I wanted to start off by stating that I am a public historian interested in the representation and roles of marginalized people in Roman antiquity. Whether as a writer at Forbes or now at Hyperallergic, my role is to take the academic research of others and then to present it to the public in a way that is accessible, informative, and at times challenges the preconceived notions that many have had about antiquity. It is in that spirit that this evening I stand on the shoulders of art historians like Professor Abbe and, for instance, the Brinkmans, as well as historians such as Nell Irvin Painter, in order to bring scholars and the public closer together. It is only through this collective journey that we can uncover the multicultural and indeed multicolored world of the ancient Mediterranean. Before we tackle the reception of polychromy from the Enlightenment era onward, we must first address the fact that ancient Greece and Rome continue to hold an outsized place of prestige within American culture. The quote, cultural capital assumed by the classical world, as Brown Classics graduate student Kelly Wynn has termed it, indeed was a double-edged sword. From the Roman fasces on the chair of the Greek temple that is the Lincoln Memorial, to the use of the austere Ionic columns on many modern courthouses, the well-known and long-spoken aesthetic vocabulary of neoclassicism is and has always been a modern means for advertising legitimacy, justifying power, and advertising the superiority of the West. This is seen most plainly in Donald Trump's wishing to, quote, make federal buildings beautiful again, end quote, by planning to mandate a return to the classical architectural style of the past through a draft executive order that was released in February. And yet classical art and architecture often mean different things to those outside of Europe and the United States, where it is no longer seen as culturally superior. The current critiques of neoclassical art by the likes of Zhu Zhen, for instance, are just one instance of people pushing back against the idea that the classical world should maintain its cultural cachet. As Zhen remarks here, he is using his art to represent many of the threatening aspects of classical art and to mirror the, quote, imperial civilizations in the Greek and Roman tradition of a power system over you, a bit like a shadow, end quote. Today, most of the general public still tends to view the ancient Mediterranean as a white one, even if Romans themselves did not recognize the later categories of black and white that were constructed by race theorists hundreds of years later. One big reason for this perception is the use of British or Australian men, in particular, to play the roles of Romans in media, from sword and sandal movies of the 1960s to the 2002 movie Gladiator. Many of the props used in these films copied sculpture and reliefs from museums such as the Capitoline in Rome or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Even in video games up until recently, we can see here examples of a game called Rise of Rome and the idea of only being allowed to play what appears to be white Roman soldiers interacting with unpainted white sculpture with a singular skin tone added to it. All of this collectively has reinforced the overall perceived whiteness of the Roman world. In the words of Cambridge classicist Tim Whitmarsh, racism is indeed emotional and not rational. This is often plain in the outrage that still goes on today online and among white supremacist groups when individuals are given darker skin tones in cartoons about ancient Rome, as was the case with a BBC cartoon about Roman Britain that came out in 2017, which had an African soldier and was released onto the BBC to outrage from people on Twitter, on Facebook, and across the areas of Britain and the US. However, as we see in a number of pieces of art from the ancient world, there was indeed a broad spectrum of skin tones, many of which did not mirror the lily-white marble of sculpture or mimic the predominantly pale BBC reenactments of Roman history that many of us have grown up with. While much of the field of classics itself has only now come to recognize and even to teach about the long history of using classical art to support white supremacy, many of those people in the general public are not aware of the prominence and input of Egyptians, North Africans, Ethiopians, Syrians, Jews, and many others who might not be categorized as white today. And yet the reason I began to study polychromy was in order to show my students that there was a broad range of peoples in the ancient world. Classics is without doubt the whitest discipline in the modern academy today, with less than 1% of faculty identifying as Black. Most of my students had never even been told this, and certainly had never seen portraits such as those from Fayum that we have looked at here tonight, or been told that there was a long history of African Roman emperors as well as bishops, which had greatly influenced the course of Mediterranean history. But things did not really click as to why deconstructing the myth of white sculpture was so important to decoupling the idea of beauty being tied to white marble until I read Princeton historian Nell Irvin Painter's incredible The History of White People. As she noted about art historians studying classical sculpture in the 18th century, quote, color in sculpture came to mean barbarism, for they assumed that the lofty ancient Greeks were too sophisticated to color their art, end quote. Classical sculpture that had its paint rubbed or scrubbed from its surface had an incredible influence not only on artistic ideas of beauty, but on developing ideas of biological race in the 18th century. The Apollo of the Belvedere, now at the Vatican Museums, was discovered in the 15th century and immediately began to be used by artists as a model of ideal beauty. The 18th century was then a formative time for taxonomies and the attempted categorization of man, of which the aesthetics of sculpture would play a very outsized part. Early theories of biological race would be heavily influenced by both aesthetics and classical art. The idea that facial angles could separate out white from Black bodies was itself developed by Dutch anatomist and artist Petrus Camper. Camper drew heavily on the aesthetic ideals of beauty espoused by art historian Johann Joachim Winckelmann and his championing of the Apollo of the Belvedere along with its celebrated white marble. He believed that when a vertical line created a 100-degree angle with a corresponding horizontal line, the ideal facial dimension had been achieved. This facial dimension was achieved by the Apollo of the Belvedere and allegedly by white European men. Anatomy artists used classical sculpture to create and then argue for the pseudoscience that was, and still is, craniometry. Camper's faith in craniometry had been pulled in part from Winckelmann, but was developed to show a spectrum of head ranges from ape to the Apollo of the Belvedere in anatomy textbooks used across Europe and the United States in medical schools. Anatomists and medical illustrators began to use white statues in order to show the ideal bodies to be achieved. By the 19th century, these white male constructed metrics of beauty had become ingrained in both European and American mindsets. White women continued to be likened to a waxen Venus and white men to be marble Apollos, whereas Black bodies were often purposefully associated with simians rather than white statues. And yet, the study of polychromy has now revealed that both bronze and marble statues had various skin tones often added to them, perhaps one of the most famous being the Riace bronzes found in 1972 off the coast of Reggio Calabria. Today, polychromy specialists like Professor Abbe are working hard to bring color back to the ancient world and in many ways to combat the use of classical art and classical architecture as a testament to white superiority by restoring its lovely colors. In my final few minutes, however, I must note that while there is much hope in giving students and the general public the tools to restore color to the ancient world and to connect the multicultural nature of the Mediterranean, there are caveats to be observed for those who wish to undergo polychromy recreations and are not trained as scientists like those we have already talked about tonight. Already, games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey out of Ubisoft in 2018 show us that these polychromy studies are permeating the mainstream and that video game creators are beginning to listen to classicists, archaeologists, and art historians. This provides a great amount of potential for academics to work with graphic designers, all in order to have people of color be represented as people in these games and as characters that are able to be played. And in places like the Rhode Island School of Design, they have also encouraged students to color and to think about polychromy through coloring books that were freely made available both digitally and in person. Another example comes from the Worcester Art Museum, where visitors can now take an iPad and paint the various orants they have there from the 3rd century BC Magna Graecia. And here I am painting one of the orants just a couple of years ago when I visited in order to try and play with the polychromy. And yet there are also polychromy reconstructions that represent a very dangerous area of argument by touting the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to reconstruct portraits. As my colleague and hyperallergic co-writer, Nisha Jr., a visiting associate professor at Harvard University this year, and I are currently researching, color reconstructions using AI rarely use spectroscopy or the remnants of actual paint in order to make their reconstructions. They are still subject to human bias and also to the prejudices of the graphic artists who create them and use the algorithms within AI, many of whom take color vocabulary from ancient texts to be gospel, when in fact these are often ambiguous and gendered terms. Or those people who use AI to do reconstructions and simply guess at them, only to then champion that a machine has created them rather than a human hand. Museums are not neutral, and neither is AI, and thus we must always be incredulous of those attempting to use polychromy today in the same manner that race theorists used them in order to make arguments for their own taxonomies in the 18th and 19th centuries. Although I see great potential in allowing exploration of ancient skin tone through digital means, and yes, we still should use AI and 3D modeling and machine learning in order to explore it, we must be on our toes for those who would still use it to weaponize whiteness through allegedly mechanical and digital means. I have given only a short overview here of the importance of the work of conservators and those working on polychromy, but also of the populace studying the history of polychromy and of color. I hope that we still continue to recreate, to reimagine, and to re-engage with the ancient world in the future. And I hope that this is a multicolored approach. Students of color in our museums and in our classrooms deserve to see themselves in the world of the ancient Mediterranean, because there were indeed individuals who looked like them and contributed to Rome's long history. Just as Camper and Winkelmann helped to create false ideas of white beauty, we too have the power to revoke it and to redraw the classical world in a diverse and multicolor manner that is much more accurate than Trump or any of his Proud Boys would ever have us admit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was excellent. So now we're going to move to the question and answer portion for as long as we can keep our panelists. I'm going to take the first question, actually. Nathan Rogers asks, why do you think the general public today has never been educated on the reality of polychromy? And I just want to give you an anecdote. my colleague, Ashley Dimming, our fellow in Islamic art, our Wheeler Mellon fellow in Islamic art, told me today that her aunt had never heard about painted classical sculpture and was really fascinated by this, and that they were going to tune in. So I hope you're both tuning in. But it's also, we're learning so much more now about it, and it's something that scholars sort of put aside and then got back to. So it is true that many people still don't know about it and still need to hear more. So to pick and choose through the questions, because there are many and I'm excited. Chateau de Courtomer, and I apologize if I've mispronounced anything at any point ever, is wondering whether the Roman busts made with colored marble were also painted, or if they were, if not painted. And I know that Sarah wanted to take that one.
Yeah, am I allowed to share my screen when when we have switched over here? Because I will pull up a few examples so we can look at it. It's probably easier than things explaining it.
I'm not sure that we can do that quickly. I know that if you answer the question, then we can also put up the link.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, a few years ago, Sean Burris, who is a art historian and wonderful person at Bowdoin Museum in Maine, and I wrote an article for Hyperallergic about multicolored uses of various types of marble. We do have sometimes remnants of paint on them, but oftentimes they are being used in order to indicate the exoticness of the individual, oftentimes associated with people, particularly from the east and the area of Asia Minor, which would be modern day Turkey. This idea of captives that are being taken, oftentimes we have this use of multicolored marbles in order to tell us that they are from an Eastern Mediterranean origin. And that is oftentimes coupled with something that might look like a Smurf hat to you because it did actually inspire the Belgian artists that made the Smurf hats, but it's called a Phrygian cap. Yes, we can link to the article and you can kind of look through it. And I'm sure that Mark has some things to say as well. Sometimes they were painted, but oftentimes they let this multicolored marble speak for itself. It was meant particularly to be the skin tones of captives that were taken by the Roman Empire. So we have a number of them, for instance, that are called kneeling captives, that have Phrygian caps on and that are kneeling as being taken by the Roman Empire.
Mark, did you want to add anything, or should we?
Sure. I mean, we do have a number of colored marble sculptures that actually preserve paint. A great example is a recently excavated hanging Marsyas in Phrygian or Pavonazzetto marble, discovered on the Via Appia near the Villa delle Quintilii, and it preserves, it's now in the Capitoline, and it preserves traces of painting on its surface. Now, the reason I mentioned this example is because it's a great illustration of how surfaces were really opportunities. So on the one hand, you can highlight the polychromatic nature of the sewn substrate, which was this exotic, luxurious material. Yet even that material is still ripe for further enhancement and definition. Yeah, I mean to suggest to you that the kind of the tendency towards a kind of puritanism of it being the material or polychromy really doesn't parallel the ancient perspective on these things, and that a polychrome marble surface was just yet more opportunity, for greater variation.
Excellent. Mark, I think the next question is for you from Molly Kukler. She wonders, how was the gilding on the Aphrodite head fixed into place? Do we know? And has there been any recent development in terms of color and sealant primer detection that indicates what we might be able to identify in the near future if we cannot currently?
Well, great question. We don't know at present exactly the method of gilding in this case. We have, of course, water gilding and adhesive gilding in antiquity as the two primary methods. And there's what I would underscore here is that you're absolutely right that there's a whole organic horizon of analysis, that even as most recently as a decade ago was basically impossible. The sample size was so enormous by archaeological polychrome standards, and increasingly we're able to get smaller and smaller samples and do even in situ organic analysis. So I think this is exactly the kind of aspect that is so key in really understanding the nuances of ancient color. It was not color field painting, and the art was in the detail, of course, and that's intimately linked in any paint layer, not simply with the colorant, but in the binding medium that's used to apply it and mix it, and then also on top of that paint layer, then the protective wax coatings and other things like that. So this is exactly the kind of horizon that's starting to come into view, and I think will really transform and enhance our understanding of ancient color in the really near future.
Margaret Cole wonders, was there a difference in coloring between the class of a person depicted in the sculpture? And that could be for either of you. I'm actually curious myself. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Do you want to take that, Sarah?
I'll go after you for sure.
Well, I'm not sure. The question exactly was: is there a relationship between class?
Is there a class difference in how you're depicted?
No, I mean it's in the sense that antiquity didn't have the idea of race, and there was no legal idea of anything like a color line. And so I think maybe one idea here could be that you do have a sort of ethnic identities, but in terms of social class, I don't think they thought in those terms.
I mean, I think you really have to look to the clothing and the jewelry and other indicators on the statue as to whether this person is a senator, whether this person is an equestrian, whether this person is a freedman, right? The inscriptions often tell us a lot about the socioeconomic level of the person, but I mean, this is a very difficult thing to discern. If they have a toga on that has a purple stripe, it obviously is going to indicate to us a tie to a senatorial man, as opposed to having someone without a toga and having a short tunic on, for instance. So I think you really are looking more to clothing rather than color in order to tell us what Romans might consider them in terms of their social class. And as Mark pointed out before, a lot of colors that we have in mosaic and in fresco and also with sculpture are along gender lines rather than along socioeconomic lines, right? So oftentimes we had the ceramic that he showed for his first slide. Women are often showed very white in Greek ceramics, what we would call very white, and then men a bit darker, right? So they're not using color for class; they're using it tied to gender, if they are modifying it or maybe tying it to their ethnicity, right? Not to class that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, class is a really difficult idea in antiquity because they weren't capitalists. Right. So this notion, or modern notion from Marxism and the like, about class identity, this doesn't have the same resonance in antiquity.
No.
I would say. No. Interesting question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Maybe something a little bit easier. We'll sort of mix it up between earlier questions and later questions, and keep typing your questions. We'll see where we get. Andrew Loke asks, how much polychromy was lost from conservators in the past and restorers trying to get to clean sculpture? I mean, we can obviously think of the Parthenon marbles right off the bat.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously very difficult to quantify. And I think it's interesting because the removal of color is not universal. There are sculptures that are discovered in the even in the 16th century that where the polychromy is retained and deliberately not removed. I think we're dealing with a really complex phenomenon. In general, objects that have been in older pre-modern collections are treated sort of the worst, if you will. But I also would hesitate to anachronistically judge. Yeah, I think the removal of this color, because this is before modern conservation ethics, and the ideas behind them of historical authenticity really existed in the developed state that we have today. But if you go to some of these older historic collections, yeah, it can be really striking, because the surfaces were quite deliberately, abraded, sanded down with emery powder and the like to remove not only burial accretion, ancient polychromy, but really to transform the marble into something that it wasn't intended to be in antiquity. And this even reaches the heights in the 19th and early 20th century of taking the most opaque, bright white then available, lead white, and literally rubbing it into the marble surface so that you get that lead white powder between the intergranular structure of the marble, so that it's more radiant than it ever was as a natural geological product. That's a fascinating historical transformation of the work of art.
Thank you. We have a couple of different questions talking about recreation. So I'll just read one from Maggie Knapp asking how reliable scans are in recreating the pigments. How much is guesswork when we're looking at gods in color and reconstructing entire statue pigment?
I don't know if we can give a percentage, but there is a great amount of guesswork, especially with skin tones in particular. I've talked to a number of people doing reconstructions in museums, from the Art Institute of Chicago to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and oftentimes there are, unless there are very small remnants that we've already looked at for skin tone, oftentimes that's the thing that they guess at the most, I would say. Not always, but this is something that oftentimes gets rubbed off or does not survive and is able to be reconstructed. And so, for instance, a lot of the reconstructions that we've had on the caryatids for the caryatids that hold up the porch of the Erechtheion, they've had 4 or 5 different skin tones based on various reconstructions. I've seen a lot of evidence that perhaps there has been a major amount of guessing, but that the audience oftentimes wants a complete reconstruction of all of the color if they're going to get any of it. And so I think that there still is, I can't give a quantifiable number, there's still a percentage of guesswork, even if we have maybe the purple that still is going to be surviving, or maybe the red, etc., that not all the colors always are going to survive collectively. So I do still think that there is a fair amount of guesswork that is going on in museums.
I would underscore that. I mean, there is a lot of guesswork. To give you a sense, we have at most 2 or 3 examples in the corpus of ancient marble sculpture where we actually have the complete paint layer. Okay, so as per the comments I made before about binding medium and wax and all the surface effects and how this changes color, there's just inherently, even when we have preserved color, an enormous amount of guesswork. My philosophy on that is that that's okay, that's a good thing. And actually, the more people looking at these works and coming up with informed speculation is all for the better, rather than having only a sort of certain aesthetic. That said, the key thing here that we need to aim for is a clear delineation of where the evidence begins and ends, and where the speculation and interpretation begin. Because that's the key variable. The aim behind Reconstructions is, of course, to communicate at the macro level what survives most often at the microscopic level. And reconstructions need to be understood as not final truths, but as working hypotheses, as current states of knowledge and the like. And in this, I think they can communicate well to the non-specialist public, which is really an essential aspect of this work.
I think that part of this is about transparency, which we've been trying to encourage with museums for a long time. So if there were multiple kind of presentations of whichever reconstruction there might be, if we had 3 or 4 of them presented to the public rather than just one, that's one way to communicate to people that we are uncertain, right? And I think oftentimes as academics and as art historians, we don't want to admit uncertainty to the public. Certainly as teachers in class, we don't want to talk about uncertainty, but having transparency about how much paint actually survives and whether the reconstruction is fully predicated on that evidence, I think is super important. And one way to do that is to allow the agency to be in the hands of the students and the people who are spectators, right? To let them interact with it and see suggestions of what it might be. Over a spectrum rather than just having one instance of it. Because then you have the same thing that you have with the AI that I was talking about, is that people start taking it as the gospel truth. And they start taking this, well, this is what Jesus looked like, right? This is exactly what Caligula looked like. In reality, that's just not true. That a lot of these reconstructions, we should have a percentage that is attached to it that's like 75% sure, right? But we don't. We don't ever have like a dotted line like we do in maps that say, I'm only 80% sure about this. And so that sometimes can be really damaging. So.
I mean, all I can say in defense of museum professionals is that there's only so much you can put on a wall. And sometimes it's quite hard to get a tablet out so that you can do like a gradation of color back and forth and decide what you think is best. But I mean, I absolutely take your point. I'm going to lob out a softball here, though, from my beloved colleague Joni Spicer, who's the curator of Renaissance and Baroque art here at the Walters Art Museum. She wonders, and if you know off the top of your head, you can also say that you don't know because that is absolutely fine. Were there any Roman sculptures excavated during the Renaissance that were pigmented? Like, were they documented as they were pulled up out of the Renaissance that were pigmented?
Great question. Something I've thought a good deal about and have been extremely frustrated by. Because, in short, we have examples of statues that we have, secure documentation back to the 16th and early 17th centuries. What more could one ask for? Well, you could ask for some comment about the visually conspicuous color. Yeah, I'm thinking especially of a wonderful head of Zeus in the Palazzo Altemps. And I would welcome your thoughts and contributions here. I've asked so many Renaissance folks this, Renaissance sculpture folks, and no one says, they actually make a note of it. And I think that in itself is fascinating in the sense that, the human eye, for all of its precision, is a remarkably subjective enterprise. Yeah. And what you write down is, of course, historically determined and the like. But great question, and there's a lot of, I think, of work to be done there, especially in terms of these images were so revolutionary in being monochrome. Yeah, this is we're in central Italy. We're not north of the Alps here, right? There is the tradition of monochrome sculpture is quite limited. So great question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
Right. We can say that there were mentions during the course of the 18th century quite frequently, especially following the excavations at Pompeii, that towards the end of the 18th century, we start getting more and more frequency of writing about polychromy. And Winkelmann even recognizes that there was polychromy, even though he doesn't think it's very pretty, and even though he doesn't think that it's as civil or as beautiful as white marble, he does know that polychromy exists, and that the excavations that are happening in the mid-18th century in Pompeii are turning up a lot of polychromatic art. So I think that's really a big turning point to mention, that the excavations at Pompeii do get citations for polychromatic works by the end of the 18th century. Yeah.
I don't want to delay us, but I mean, I would say one of the things we have to be aware of, is that our notions of monochrome and monochrome and polychromy, are really products of the 18th century. And that, they're unparalleled in ancient terminology. And I would question if they, and I simply don't know, if there were something that was closely equivalent in the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the things that's so remarkable is how you look at historic collections of sculpture that have been endured, like Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, and these sculptures have been, I mean, they're not white. Marble actually isn't white. It's, I mean, we call it white, but it's really, it has its own rich chromatic range. So I think it's really, these are some fascinating questions about reception and aesthetics of the material substrate itself. So, sorry.
I want to bring up a question from Elizabeth Norman, asking how can conservation, curatorial, and interpretive professionals, in order to provide a better understanding of the ancient use of color, and this goes into like reception studies, how can we avoid the traps of our own biases in our contemporary moment as we share these things?
Lisa?
I'm here to learn from you. For me, I think the answer lies in light reconstructions. If you've been to the Arapakis Museum at night, then you perhaps have been able to take in the fact that they do a reconstruction of all of the polychromy that we think was on the Arapakis. Again, it's a guess, but there are remnants of greens and yellows, etc., that had survived, even though Mussolini scrubbed it kind of clean, as art conservators. But Rome is very into light reconstructions now, and these light reconstructions do not damage the piece, to my knowledge, because they try and only have it for a short period of time at certain times of day, and they are using light that in no way hurts the surface. But they oftentimes will change the different colors that are being reconstructed on the Augustus of Prima Porta or on the Arapakis. And I love this idea that you can show people that there was color without giving them a definitive answer as to what it looked like. And I'm not sure that it matters 100%. I mean, I think art historians would probably disagree with me saying that, but I think that the biggest point is to show them there was color, right? And maybe not always to say definitively that these is what they are. Right, and that's why I liked the iPad at the Worcester Art Museum, right? Because it allows the agency in the people rather than just you as the curator within the museum context. And so I would love to see more use of light displays that say, I don't know, this person could be X, Y, and Z. This person could look like this or that or this, and we don't know for sure, but we do know it was painted.
I would say that a key component here is almost philosophical, and that is the ethics of self-reflexivity, and this is something that is, I think, the contemporary discipline of conservation absolutely excels at. Is an endless questioning before action, before determination, and so what are we cleaning? Why are we cleaning? Investigations of the surface. What are we? Is this being driven by needs of preservation, by questions of legibility, by questions of aesthetics? And it's when we get into those latter categories that I think we have to be even more self-reflexive. So I think that is probably the best way, is to actually have sort of an ethical code, if you will, that sort of suggests a process, rather than that's focused more on the process than on the result. That might be too abstract, but I think if you look at contemporary conservation practice, it's really one of the leading lights in my view.
All right, I think we'll just take 2 more questions. One is from Cecily Hughes. Were black marble sculptures ever painted, or was the color of the material considered to encompass all range of black or Ethiopian skin tones for the entire ethne?
We do have several examples of black marble, if we want to use that term, sculpture that have polychromy. There's a great example that's illustrated that I mentioned in the New Yorker article, and that's illustrated there. You can readily find it online. That head is actually an interesting thing, is that it's not entirely clear if the paint layer there on the surface may actually have been from an ancient repair. But that said, I think these marble sculptures, they have inlaid eyes often, and we have them preserved, in fact. So these were absolutely polychromatic works. Yeah, they were enhanced with color, with metallic inlay and the like. So it wasn't that they were really going for sort of a black monochrome as opposed to the white monochrome.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we haven't really talked that much about it. But there's 2 eyes that survive in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that have these bronze eyelashes, right? And then you have, I think it's just like a white marble inlay. Oftentimes you had clothing that was draped onto sculpture. The use of jewelry, right? Small little earrings that are put onto them. There was a wonderful ivory sculpture that had rubies placed into it that was at on recent display at the Met that was, I think, originally from Syria. So I'm really glad that Mark brought up the fact that it's not just painting that makes them polychromatic. It's the addition of jewels and clothing, right? And metal, lots of metal oftentimes. That's going to add color to it. So it's not just the paint that is going to make it multicolored.
An interesting side point here related to sort of the use of inlay is that I'm not aware of any example where we have where the flesh areas of a stone sculpture are added in black marble. We have the opposite, where we have a polychromatic stone being used for the body, and then the flesh tones are added in white marble and then painted to appropriate chromatic range. That might give us some insights into sort of the assumptions behind the use of such materials.
That's wonderful. And I mean, I would just add again, like, we do have many instances, because other commentators have asked about this. We do have many instances of bronze sculptures that are pigmented in different ways with copper or silver or gold. So the ancient world was very colorful. I do want to just end on one question that I think is sort of a positive way thinking forward. And Molly Kufler asks, what kind of reconstruction process is the most exciting to you for future exhibits on color in the ancient world?
For me, it's 3D modeling. I think the work that's being done at ISA NYU with Sebastian Heath and a lot of his 3D modeling students is what has gotten me the most excited. I would also say what Daniel Pett is doing as connected with a number of museums in the United Kingdom. The 3D modeling and the allowance of people to print out sculpture and then to interact with it, to either paint it digitally or actually physically once they 3D print it. I think that's really allowing museum collections to go out into the public in a way that is really exciting. So when the British Museum decided to have Daniel do the entirety of the collection, he started it kind of secretly at night, and then the British Museum was like, oh yeah, we always wanted you to 3D model all of our collection. And then he began to add colors to it and to work with other people who were studying polychromy in order to have suggestions. Places like Sketchfab and 3D modeling platforms that allow you not only to teach polychromy with your students as a pedagogical tool, but then to have them physically play with that object because they may never be able to afford a trip to the British Museum or may never be able to afford going to Baltimore to the Walters. That for me is the most exciting because I think it's the release of these collections in an open access forum and allowing people to really play with color. But that's me.
I would say, yeah, I mean, the flexibility of digital construction is absolutely a great way to emphasize the actual divide that I mentioned before between the state of the evidence and the state of interpretation. And that's something that we're working on actually with the 2 portrait busts of the emperors and empress that I mentioned. I think that's wonderful. My caveat is that, I'm really an objects person, so I really like materials. And the digital gets us away from the actual working process. An illuminated chromatic screen, like the one you're looking at, is qualitatively different, than the ancient experience where materials really mattered. They had real associations. They of course had physical properties that were limiting and enhancing in some ways. So I think we need to have I think we can't lose the materiality of these things in our digital reconstructions. And I think that's probably some of the most interesting things, as well as the sort of aesthetic projections of color, is actually looking closely at color, replicating these when we have cross sections, replicating the process, getting into the real nitty gritty of grain size, sequence of application, thickness, and of paint layer and things like this, gnosis, wax coatings, and the like. I mean, this really brings us so close. And for those of you that are interested in Reconstruction, I think this is a great way. So, I mean, I'm a big advocate of getting your hands dirty. This is what the ancients did, of course. So I would just say, have at it.
That was wonderful. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all the questions. Thank you again to both of our panelists, Professors Mark Abbe and Sarah Bond. I want to say thanks again to the Boshell Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. I need to especially thank the Walters Art Museum Education Department, especially Joy Davis and Paloma Feliciano, who are responsible for the gestation and organization of this event, and to Sydney Adamson for helping behind the scenes. And thank you all for joining us and having such an interesting chat. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.